This episode is part of the EUTERPE podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
Hello, and welcome to the EUTERPE podcast, where we explore transnational writing and gender. I'm Séamus O'Kane, and joining me today is the Dutch-Uruguayan poet, Maxime Garcia Diaz. Maxime Garcia Diaz's Het is warm in de hivemind, in English, It is warm in the hivemind, won the Sea Budding Prize in 2022 for the best debut poetry collection published in the Dutch language. In this multilingual volume, she explores how girlhood is constructed in our post-digital age, the blurring of the boundaries between online and offline spaces, and post-human identities in an era of rapid technological change. This is a work where the voices of Sylvia Plath, Audrey Wolin, and Donna Haraway sit alongside quotes from Fox News and emojis, encapsulating the hyper-connectivity of our post-digital, internet-infused culture. Maxime is currently based in Iowa. She is completing a poetry MFA with the prestigious Iowa Writers Workshop. And of course, she continues to write and perform her poetry there. So, Maxime Garcia Diaz, you're very welcome and thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
So, sometimes the best place to start is at the beginning. Can you talk to us about your relationship with different languages, beginning with your childhood?
That's a good place to start because I think that's where my current relationship with multiple languages in my writing comes from. I was raised by a Dutch mother and a Uruguayan father. So really my first language is Dutch and my second language is Spanish, which I don't speak nearly as well as Dutch or English, my third language. I think like a lot of Dutch children, I learned English young and sort of was thrust quite like aggressively into speaking English at a high level and with a lot of comfort. Myself, I think of it this way, that when I graduated from reading children's books to reading adult books, I also graduated from reading Dutch books to reading English books. I didn't quite become like an adult reader in Dutch the way many Dutch people do, or people all over the world in their first language. I think my mother was just very into English literature and not very connected to Dutch culture or literature. And of course, my father was an immigrant and had a particular relationship to Dutch as well. And I could see also his accent and way of speaking Dutch being received a particular way in Dutch society. So I think my own sort of early discomfort with the Dutch language and maybe culture at large, although we don't need to go that far, but definitely the language kind of arose in that context of having like an immigrant father whose integration was sort of always up for debate, and then a Dutch mother who was not very connected to Dutch society and culture. And so I started reading in English sort of throughout my teens, and I also started writing in English. So I think when I was growing up as like an adolescent and sort of developing as a writer, all of that was happening in English, which is interesting and something that I see happening to other Dutch people as well. And I didn't really return to the Dutch language until after I had graduated from college, which was also in English. English has been colonizing me or whatever, early age.
And in the household, were you speaking to your mother and father in Dutch the whole time, or was there also Spanish and English present?
Mostly Dutch and some Spanish, I would say. Even though I can see it, the causes of it in my family life, in actuality, I was just like a normal Dutch child growing up in sort of a normal Dutch household. Also because my parents didn't live together. So, but whatever relationship to English I had came from some kind of, like, it wasn't given in by the household.
And your early creative writing efforts as a teenager, that was in English or in Dutch?
Yeah, I mean, I think in elementary school I wrote in Dutch in sort of like this childlike way. And I think getting more serious about writing and putting more effort into it, for me, kind of aligned exactly with becoming more interested in the English language. So as a teenager, I wrote in English.
In your view, are there creative possibilities that open up to you when you write in languages other than Dutch? Is there a certain freedom? And when you're using a particular language, do you feel that you're positioning yourself within a particular tradition or a discourse?
That's a really great question. For me, when I was writing in English as a young person, and less so today, but definitely as a teenager, I think it had something to do with that it was the language of media. It was a language that I consumed all my media in: books, television, and movies. So it's
Mm.
almost like it became the language of representation, representing life in art. That meant translating it into English. What was interesting about that is that I was writing in a language that I didn't live in, and that was sort of divorced a little bit from like the day-to-day environment. I do think I felt more free in English, but I don't know if it was because I saw more creative opportunities there or more just because I didn't see much of them in Dutch, which is probably because I didn't consume much creative output in Dutch. And then I think your question about position in a tradition, to this day, I'm still not even much more. I'm not very knowledgeable in any kind of literary tradition, I would say. But I am more knowledgeable in the English language literary tradition than in the Dutch one. That also has to do with studying in English and studying in this sort of globalized transnational sphere where you study literature, but you study literature in English. So it doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily come from English, but it is all presented to you in English.
And that is evident in your work. I mean, you're referring to Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, Allen Ginsberg. I didn't pick up on any Dutch writers when I was reading your work.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think all the first poets I loved were all, I think, all American even, but all definitely writing in the English language.
And you mentioned briefly how your language and your literature were colonized by English as you were growing up. I know you meant that kind of facetiously, but now that you're older and maybe become more politically aware, are you more aware of those power dynamics between English and Dutch? Do you see English as this dominant language that's maybe eroding other cultures?
Oh, definitely, definitely. I think I mean, yeah, I was being facetious because it is funny to be like a person from one former colonial empire and then to be like, I'm being colonized by the one that was more successful or something in the long run, which I think is an interesting position for Dutch to have because it's not, you talk about it in a different way than you would talk about like Quechua, you know? Like I think when you think about something like Quechua being eroded by Spanish, you can see like a lot of a history of like really intense suffering and bloodshed behind it. And you don't have the same history between Dutch and English. It's more of a question of like this is a very small country. It once had a really outsized role on the global stage, and it no longer does have that role. And now it's just one of the many small countries in the world whose languages are being eroded by English, which has as much to do with kind of, I think, the uh, Dutch society's sort of willingness to capitulate to English and to welcome it as like the language of global commerce, and also a kind of a weird lack of nationalism that is now changing. But I do definitely think like it's a problem. I mean, I think just sort of the homogenization of the world and languages in the world is a problem in and of itself, even if it's not a matter of like these people were colonized by those people. It's just like a tragedy when small languages are lost, or medium-sized languages, especially when they are lost because there's one dominant force that is steamrolling over the rest of them.
And do you pick up in these tensions because you use so much English in your own poetry? Is that something maybe you've received criticism for, or you maybe feel some tension there?
Yeah, I definitely feel some tension. I don't know if in the reception of my book, if that actually became part of the criticism or of any criticism that there was. I don't really remember that, but I do definitely feel that tension myself
Mm.
and like discuss it with, friends and writer friends. And some writer friends would feel very strongly about um, what we in the Netherlands call verengelsing, which means Anglification. And there was this manifesto published a few years ago called Against English. It's like a debate that kind of lives in universities and cultural life in the Netherlands. I think the way I thought about it with my first collection is that I was coming to that collection with the idea that I had this problematic relationship to Dutch because I'd grown up writing in English. And I didn't write in Dutch until I was about 23. And I was very sort of pragmatically thinking about being like eligible for funding schemes and other such opportunities which come from the national government. And I think what I felt then is that allowing English into my Dutch was like rescuing Dutch for me. I had all these ideas about how allowing Dutch to be impure would allow it to have a sort of resilience. But now I feel a little bit differently about that. And I think my first collection was really a project of kind of reflecting the lived experience of being like a millennial Verengels person. And I think with my second collection, which I'm working on now and which is coming out in September, it's actually coming out in a bilingual 2 books. Well, that's sort of an interesting process because one is in Dutch and one is in English, which means that I am not doing the same thing that I was doing with my first collection. So essentially, these 2 books are not multilingual. Both of them are meant to be in a kind of pure Dutch and then a pure English, and which is very unnatural to me. But I guess now I feel more invested in the idea of like preserving, trying to, in an unnatural way, have a book that is completely in Dutch as much as I can make it.
And was that a creative challenge for you that you set yourself, or is there something more ideological happening there?
I think definitely there was some kind of shift for me in the last couple of years, which is strange because I went to America and committed to like a temporary literary life in literally the core of the English. I think what I felt maybe and what I started feeling is that if I would let that keep happening, so write in a kind of Dutch English mix, that English would just creep further and further until I was writing in like an English with like 10% Dutch. I came to some kind of idea that unless I did something not drastic, but kind of unless I sort of made an artificial barrier, then English would just keep creeping. And so it was a creative challenge for the second collection because I'm doing the translation myself. And so essentially what is happening is that for some reason, I can translate everything into English. But when I try to translate in English into Dutch, I struggle more than the other way around. I'm using machine translation as well in the process, taking it out of myself and putting it into the machine, which is a whole other sort of kettle of fish, ideologically. But this second project isn't as interested in a natural language. I realized that a natural language would allow for that sprawl of English if I didn't do something drastic to preserve Dutch for me in my creative practice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you kind of touched upon it a little. I think your approach to language feeds into this, but the question of identity, as people like Rosie Braidotti would say, identity is always fluid, always plural, always in the process of changing, becoming something else. Has living in the United States given you a new perspective on that, in particular about the Latina community, for example, and maybe how Spanish is in your life in a way that maybe wouldn't be possible in the Netherlands? Or has that maybe materialized in a different way?
No, definitely. I think part of the reason why I was interested in coming to the United States as well is sort of because there's such a large Hispanic community here. And I do get much more opportunities to speak Spanish here, or to practice Spanish, or to encounter. It's a very different trajectory than my own identity, which is Uruguay to the Netherlands. Most people I know here are Mexico to the United States, which I guess just shows kind of the different shades in the Latin American spectrum. Like Uruguay and Mexico are really far apart and quite different. But it is interesting that, I mean, I've put a lot of effort over the last decade or so into trying to learn and develop my Spanish. And it is very nice to have that now in this weird sort of situation bear fruit. I think in regards to identity, which I think happens to everyone from a European country, which is that you kind of don't feel European until you come to America, because America thinks of Europe as a unit. Like, oh, I actually do have a lot in common with like Slovenians or something, the Finnish or the Portuguese, you know? I think I also feel more comfortable being Dutch outside of the Netherlands, and I've grown more conscious of my European identity, whatever that means.
Has your experience in the US changed your relationship to your art? How has it changed you as a writer?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I came here for a poetry program, so I think slightly changed my relationship to art in general, I think. And the process of writing and making definitely underwent a lot of change and is still sort of in flux. I think the big thing that it's done for me is that the English language, which has been with me for most of my life and most of my writer's life, that English language was tethered to a place. You're growing up as like a Dutch person from like a middle class or upper middle class background. You speak Dutch, you go to college, you go to an English language college, maybe increasingly so now. you live a part of your life in English, but that English is sort of a transnational, global English, and it's not regional. So then you come to America and like, I would have this experience where I would pronounce something wrong and one of my American friends would correct me. And then another American friend that would be like, no, where I come from, we say it this way. And which just is like, English is such a huge language and is spoken in so many places that there's is a sort of interesting thing that happened is that when I was writing in English, it just became less abstract and more tethered to place, which is sort of the reason why I originally switched from my abstract transnational English to Dutch, my local language. So now my English has become local or like placed. And I guess it always was sort of an American English, but it is even more so now. And it's tethered to like American life.
So your work has now been translated into Spanish with a forthcoming publication by the iconic publishing house Eloisa Cartonera in Buenos Aires. Can you talk to us a little bit about the translation process? How did the idea of translating into Spanish come about, and how much collaboration took place?
Yeah, it's actually not forthcoming anymore. It came out, but it came out in a very small edition of cardboard books that are only available in Argentina. It's really elusive, but it's really cool. Yeah, I was really, really happy about that. The idea came about because there was a translator, and it's sort of interesting how these things I've noticed go through people and they go through one specific person being interested in doing the translation.
Yeah.
I guess unless, I don't know, you win the Nobel Prize or something, then it comes from the industry, but it comes from a person otherwise. So there was one person, one Spanish translator who I think was working on some poems from a collection for like a translation course. Her name is Catalina Kepernich. And I think she's just sort of spearheaded the project and got Eloisa Cartonera involved. And what was really cool is that I got to have some conversations with her about the translation of the collection. My Spanish, I mean, it's good enough to read my own work in Spanish, but it's not good enough to really read the whole translation with like a fine. So sort of the actual translation process was more, just on the translator's side, which makes sense. But I got to kind of participate in conversations about basically explaining my work, among where there was this character whose name is Flora Wolkeveld in the Dutch original, who Catalina had translated as Flor Arcoiris, which means flower. Well, Flor is like a name. Arcoiris means rainbow. And then we had this wonderful conversation where I kind of got to delineate who Flora Wolkeveld is and what I was thinking about. This is sort of goes back to place and like region, where all she had to go on was just the name and the fact that the name Flora Wolkeveld means Flora is like a common Dutch girl's name and Wolkeveld means field of clouds. But really it doesn't come through the actual meaning to me. Like I was thinking of this specific kind of character, a basic middle-class Dutch white girl of a particular kind of cultural environment. And so we got to sort of translate that whole like social and I guess like local construct into Argentinian culture. Paulina immediately understood what kind of girl I was talking about and came up with the name Feli Campoverde. Feli sounds like a girl who like rode horses as a child, so like I guess it was all about class. And that was really exciting. And that was really cool because the translator got to learn about the specific Dutch world and I got to learn about the specific Argentinian world.
Yeah, that's a really cool interaction. And of course, it's a multilingual volume. You have English, Dutch, French, and there's a Greek word or two thrown in as well. Was this kept in the translation or everything was changed to Spanish?
So I think actually that Catalina and the publisher ended up coming to this decision that there couldn't be as much English in the translation. And actually, I think in the end, almost everything was translated into Spanish. So the book was actually made less multilingual. And that has to do, I think, with the specific context. And I think that also has to do with why I don't use Dutch in my English language poems that I write here in Iowa. Because I think the way I was using English in Dutch for that first collection had a lot to do with the specific context and Dutch society. And that I knew my audience would understand English and also that English would have a particular position for them. And I think for the Argentinian context, it was more so English is a much more foreign language than for the Dutch context. It wouldn't have this interesting position it has for Dutch readers where they understand everything, more or less. And it has a particular flavor that it's coming to them in English. Also because the publisher has a sort of like a socially conscious goal, and they really care about like accessibility. They were conscious of the fact that for a lot of Argentinian readers, it would just be like a lot of the book is in a foreign language that I don't understand. So that was interesting.
Yeah. So has this collaboration changed your relationship with the Spanish language? And is there something that we can expect to see in your output in the future?
So I think I've experimented in the past with bits of Spanish in otherwise English language or Dutch language poems, but I think I have sort of a tortured relationship to Spanish as well, like I think many sort of children of immigrants with their ancestral language have. I think the way that this translation impacted my relationship to Spanish is that it was nice to have this experience with Spanish that didn't come through my father, that one connection, that I could have my own separate connection. I really appreciated that. I don't see it going much further than sort of experimentation. If I were to have my own Spanish language experience again. It's interesting about my first collection that there is no Spanish in it, but there is French and Greek, which I think speaks to that torture relationship.
So one of the most striking features of Het is warm in de hivemind is its materiality. So we have illustrations, emojis, altered photographs, hyperlinks, and so on. Just as you tested the limits of what is a Dutch language publication, you also pushed the limits of what constitutes a print publication. Eloisa Cartonera are the forerunners of the Cartonera movement, which began in the early 2000s, and that is now spread as a cultural phenomenon throughout Latin America. The covers are made from recycled cardboard, beautifully painted, and every book is hand-stitched. These Cartonera publications were born out of economic necessity, but they're also appreciated as works of art. In this translation process, were you able to retain the multimodal and digital aspects of your work? And do you think this new format will also change how people read, receive, and interpret the work?
Well, that's a really cool question because in some ways I feel like the Spanish translation is an even more material book, like maybe because it's made of existing material and maybe because it's in some ways sort of elusive, that it's it's hard to get. It's I think impossible to get outside of Argentina, and inside Argentina it's a little bit outside of like kind of streamlined commercial processes, and which I think is kind of cool. So I think like the links and stuff that was just preserved in the Spanish translation. And I think it just works sort of the same way as with the Dutch original. It just makes like a digital world all be in print. And I guess it became part of the project that it is taking elements of the digital world and putting them into the analog world so that the links are not clickable because they are printed on paper.
Great. And following up on that, do you see a future for the medium of the print book? Or do you think it's too limited to encapsulate our modern world?
Oh no, I think we're going through a time of great pressure and tension in the screen and like technology and the way that I guess communication technologies interfere with our brains and our daily lives. I guess there's something about the printed book that is more permanent, like it's just more resilient. And I think that also culturally and like emotionally, I hope and I think that a lot of people are noticing that the screen as this kind of endlessly interactive and like mutable space has particular effects that maybe aren't really desirable for our brains. I definitely hope that there's a future for the printed book, and I think it would be very, very bad for humanity if there wasn't.
And in terms of what you did in that first book, in terms of pushing the boundaries of what is a print book and is it analog, is it digital, is it connected, is that something that you feel that you've done now, or is it still an idea that's playing in your mind when you create more work?
It's weird. In some ways, I do feel like I'm done with it. I tend to cycle pretty quickly in my work between different things I want to do, or not between, but really just from the thing I want to do to like the next thing I want to do. I think I feel kind of the thing about the screen and like sort of the affordances of digital media is that I think they can be so limitless that it becomes overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sort of enjoying the constraints of a printed book and of just accepting that you cannot really translate the digital experience to the analog. Like, although that is interesting. And I think that is what I tried to do a little in the first book. But I think now I'm interested in sort of analog experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you've mentioned in previous interviews that there is a view that the internet and the digital aren't suitable topics for poetry. And of course, you've demonstrated otherwise. But when thinking about internet culture, we have to consider the brief life of memes, of trends, of shifting discourses, and so on. Something can trend one day and then become old news the next. A hilarious meme can become cringe within the same time frame. Is there a risk or a difficulty for you when it comes to representing something that's so vast and so ephemeral? And do you feel that you captured a particular moment in time? And perhaps 10 years from now, these poems will no longer be decipherable.
When the book was coming out, I was thinking about that a lot, and we were talking about that a lot, and the idea of timelessness in literature. And I guess when I was writing this book, I was really interested in sort of like lack of timelessness, something being deliberately dated. It was sort of a generational divide in how it was understood when it came out, so that a lot of people my age and who were sort of very online would understand it immediately, and a lot of people who from the baby boomer generation, it would literally be indecipherable. I'm working on the English language translation right now, and I think to me, a lot of the poems feel so dated.
Mhm.
I don't know, in some ways it's like if I showed them to people here, they would think of them as new. We're not all moving through history
Yeah.
at the same time. I think it's just sort of a weird balance between accepting that something exists in a moment in time, and then also accepting that just the fact of it being over, of it being like an old meme, makes you cringe when you read it in a different way than something that isn't tied to like memes and like this really ephemeral and cyclical like culture.
Mhm.
So I guess I would hope that there was something still to be taken from it, even if you didn't understand the meme references. Yeah.
Yeah. So the final question, your poetry is quite global in its outlook, in terms of its references to the literary canon, critical theory, pop culture, Tumblr, technological advances, and so on. At the moment, our political climate is characterized by instability, uncertainty, and rapid change. And we are seeing progress go backwards in many areas. We're watching it all unfold online, and the internet is a constant barrage of quasi dystopian, often surreal events, existing in a web of bots, hate speech, distortions, and propaganda. Is it even possible to represent and discuss our current moment in a focused way when our attention is being diverted in so many different areas? Is our world too fragmented at the moment to be represented in art? What is the role of an artist at the present moment?
I mean, I think that is a really good question, and I think it's like attention spans being diverted, I think is sort of what that is all about. There are a lot of forces at play and that are essentially fighting for your attention and your eyeballs and your brain space, and that I think it is a really important act to direct your own attention to what you want it to be on or something. Not as in like, oh, you should live in a house on the prairie but more as in like that you retain some kind of agency over your attention span and how you're looking at things, I think. It's true that I think that you can just say that the world is more fragmented than it ever was before. It's like these far right movements are almost I don't know, I think of it as sort of just the failures of, like, this thing we thought we had, which is globalization. One world lives together beautifully under, neoliberalism, and then it's sort of failing, and now we have all these sort of, like, hyper-nationalist movements. I don't know if I think of fragmentation as something that you can't represent. I
Mhm.
think actually, maybe for my own practice, I think of fragmentation as something I naturally tend towards wanting to represent because I enjoy fragmentation in art. But I do think that it is important to like, try and come to a point where you leave behind fragmentation and you actually take a stand, or you actually make a point, or
Mhm.
you try to, like, cohere again or unify again. Because otherwise,
Mhm.
how are we ever gonna get out of I used to be very drawn to, like, postmodern plurality, which I still am, and I think we all should be, but I also think it's like, it should never be an excuse to not take a stand, essentially.
Yeah,
Pick a place and say, "This is actually true, and this is what we should do."
that's great. Thanks very much. That's a great note to end on. So thanks very much for your time. Maxime Garcia Diaz, thank you very much for joining us the whole way from Iowa in the United States. And good luck with your forthcoming publications, and we will be following them with interest.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.